introduction, and then if anybody comes, we'll just have a little pause. Is that good? Yeah. Good. Thank you, Lydia. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you very, very much for coming this evening on this lovely warm summer evening. We're really, really glad to host Kelly Madigan from L-P Archaeology here to give a talk about the sarcophagus find. Thank you so much for coming, Kelly. It's brilliant. I'm just going to give you a little introduction. Some of you are very familiar with the Sydney Gardens project, and maybe some of you aren't so familiar. So just to remind you or let you know what's going on, I'm Sue Palmer, and I'm the community ranger in the Sydney Gardens project. When any project is given a capital build grant or restoration grant, there's always an accompanying public engagement programme, and that's kind of what I do. I organise the events and activities, I work with volunteers, I help organise the interpretation, I work with all kinds of priority audiences and do all kinds of different things. You're welcome to ask me about any of that kind of stuff, and I've put lots of materials up here for you to explore afterwards, which I'll talk about as we get to the questions time. So the Sydney Gardens, which are owned by Bath Council, was given a Heritage Lottery grant back in 2019, a full grant of over £3 million to restore the park, to create a new play area, and also to open up areas of the park that aren't accessible to the public at the moment, and all kinds of other things. And it's a significant site. Obviously, it used to encompass the Holborn. It was this hexagonal shape, and it looks like the winds on Mars. If you look at the winds on Mars, it's the same pattern. And it's had a very, really special history. Obviously, now the Holborn is an independent charity, running arts events and hosting international exhibitions. But the site is really, really linked, so it's also really lovely for us to be here in the Holborn space. It opened as a Georgian pleasure garden in 1795, and then obviously the canal came through shortly afterwards, and then the railway. And it's very unusual for a public park to have these two major transport infrastructures going through. Sydney Gardens does have a really high heritage significance. It's included in the Historic England Register of Parks and Gardens, and it's also got several Grade 2 and Grade 2 star listed structures, including the ironwork loos and the loggia. And the gardens are also obviously within Bath World Heritage Site and designated Bath City Centre Conservation Area. So it's got a really, it's got powerful resonance to it, and obviously a very important site. So during our restoration project, we haven't had any kind of archaeological plan to kind of dig up Sydney Gardens and see what was underneath it. We've known historically, and Kelly will, I'm sure, talk more about this, that it's on the site of a Roman cemetery, and quite how far into the garden that went, we weren't totally clear about. Other significant finds have happened in the park before. I think when the park was originally excavated, or like the plan when it was originally built, they uncovered a Roman stone to Gallus Calpurnius Receptus, the priest of Sulis, and this is at the Roman Baths. And also in 1861, 1864 and 1914, 4 Roman stone coffins were discovered in Sydney Gardens. And I think those of you who've ever come to we did a festival of archaeology back in 2019 where Hannah Mile, who was our former intern, came, and we actually marked out the exact site of where it was in the garden, which was very exciting actually, with some kids, and said, that's where the coffin was found. So, it's a historic site, it's layered with history, so it's really, really delightful to have this find of the sarcophagus. So basically, our archaeologist on the project is called Susanna Parker, and she works for RPS Group. And then as soon as there's a watching brief, that's when L-P Archaeology are employed to visit the site and then be on site and watch for when there's earthworks. And then you can tell us everything else there is to tell us. Okay, and I'm just going to move to the back of the space before we start. Thanks, Kelly.
All right, no problem. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. I did have some anxiety dreams that I would be doing this to an empty room, so I am quite pleased that people are interested and have turned up. It's also really nice to be giving the first ever public talk about our excavations in this location, and to an audience who are so familiar with the gardens themselves. I have to say, before we got this job, I didn't know the Sydney Gardens existed, so I'm glad I do, because I've had quite a lot of cream teas in the cafe out the back now. So the talk itself is going to broadly be in 4 parts. I'm going to try and explain why we're here. I'm also going to try and explain what we found and the context of what we found and why that is significant. And then I'm going to move on to the excavation of the sarcophagus itself, which we did in situ on site at the beginning of June. And then I want to tell you about the initial assessment results, which are hot off the press. I literally got them yesterday afternoon, so I haven't had too much time to assimilate them myself, but they're pretty cool, quite frankly. So, also just to say, I use the terms coffin and sarcophagus interchangeably. I personally don't see a difference, but if there's any academics amongst you, you might differ, but sorry now for what I'm about to say. Right, how do I move across? There we go. Okay, so as has briefly been explained, the park was granted HLF funding, and through that they needed some form of archaeological management plan, which Susanna Parker, who's my client, who I go to all the time, phoning her up about our latest findings, she created an archaeological management plan for the park. That archaeological management plan had to be approved by the South West Heritage Trust, who in turn, they are advisors to the local council on archaeological matters relating to the planning system. Hopefully I explained that. And so when there were groundworks within parts of the park that were deemed archaeologically sensitive, it was up to my team, who were commissioned to go and watch the groundworks take place. So an archaeological watching brief is a controlled form of archaeological mitigation, where a qualified archaeologist literally watches the machines pull back the ground in spits. And if we find something of interest, we usually jump in and record it. And then if we find something of significance, then work stops and we call in the client, we call in the county archaeologist, in this case the South West Heritage Trust, and decisions are made about how to proceed, how to move forward with making the right decision for the archaeology, and also the right decision for the client where possible. So this park, as it's already been mentioned, is archaeologically sensitive, and it's archaeologically sensitive for 2 reasons. It's part of the Bathwick Cemetery, the extent of which has never been found, and indeed when we found our sarcophagus, everyone was like, really? It should be over there, we weren't expecting it this far north. But also the Georgian Pleasure Gardens, which earlier iterations of the Georgian Pleasure Gardens are archaeology in themselves. And so we've also monitored, as part of our works, some sort of earlier landscaping that's taken place. And then just to have a tiny segue, because I couldn't work out how to fit this into other parts of my talk, I just wanted to explain the planning process in archaeology specific to this project. So we have the work on site where we're doing the data gathering. In this case, it was a watching brief, and we did find something significant, and that automatically triggered a big meeting on site. In fact, there were 5 meetings on site, and we took the decision to excavate. Now, that is one phase of a 3-part long project. The second phase is the phase that we're in at the moment, which is the Post-Excavation Assessment. So me and my team have to deliver a final report in early September to our client, which states the facts of what we have found, and then also makes reasonable suggestions for what we could do next. And then what we could do next is done in the last phase, which is post-excavation analysis, which is scientific testing on the things that we have found and also the publication of the results. There we go. So just briefly about the location. So the areas shaded in pink here are areas deemed archaeologically sensitive, and when Edgar builders have been reducing the ground in these areas as part of the improvement works for the park, we've turned up and had a look at what they've been digging, and we were in the northern part of the park up by the bowling green, or what was the bowling green, and we hit upon an island of surviving Roman stratigraphy. So this area, this whole bowling green, was actually made up of artificial layers of quite modern material. And as it got lower and lower towards the tennis courts, we found that there were surviving subsoils, and there was a very small area of really quite amazing Roman stratigraphy, which is here, if the slide works. Okay, so this whole area, it does actually extend across here and down here, and it's probably about 10 meters by 6 meters, so it's quite a small plot. And what we have here is actually 7 different phases of archaeology, starting with the earliest. So this line here, solid line, goes around here, is a very large prehistoric quarry pit. So the natural on this site is very much like type 1, if you ever have laid a patio, very much like type 1 sand. So it was sought after for building. And so, you know, we don't actually quite know when in the prehistoric yet. We haven't had the pottery dated. But they came along and dug a very large quarry pit that actually goes outside of our area of excavation. And you can see here, we put a slot through that pit, and it seemed to keep decreasing in depth, and then obviously we couldn't dig anymore because then we would be outside the area that we were restricted to digging in. But you'll see this pit is cut by what this grey thing is supposed to have a label on it saying wall, but it doesn't. So this is a Roman wall. It's trench built, and it's based with Roman concrete. And actually, the person that actually was excavating it thought that this wall was the coolest thing on the entire site, despite everything else that we found. So we also tried to investigate the stratigraphic relationship between the pit and the wall, and in doing so, as you can see, we managed to not find the Roman sarcophagus. So we managed to miss this by just a couple of inches, and we didn't know that it was there. So then we managed to reduce some of the ground level on this area as we were working more towards the north. And when we did that, we clipped the top of the sarcophagus here. We didn't cause the sarcophagus any damage, but we actually thought, oh, it's just another wall. And we peeled it back to find a sarcophagus lid. the sarcophagus itself is within its own grave cut, and other funerary archaeology related to, well, actually they're probably not related stratigraphically, but within the context of what we're seeing here, this pink blob that you can see, this is the location of a human cremation. It's unurned, and it's the only known cremation to date from the Bathwick Roman Cemetery. They were probably actually quite frequent, but people just thought they were a little blob in the ground and just dug them out back in the Victorian period when they were re-landscaping this area. This yellow blob, this is actually characterised as a votive deposit because it is on the top of the cut. When I phoned up some specialists and said, oh, we've got this votive deposit, it's a little tiny little jar at the top of the cut of the sarcophagus and of the pit. They're like, oh, that will be a chicken in a pot and dedicated to Mercury. Actually, it's not. It's another human cremation, but this time in an urn. And based upon the size of the pot, we're going to say it's either part of a person that's been burned and put in there, or it's a baby, because the pot was maybe 20 centimetres wide at its widest point. And then lastly, we have this bit here. It's indicated by a few blobs, unfortunately, of bone. I couldn't find any photos, so I actually, in the course of this excavation, we took almost 19,000 photographs because of the way that we were recording it, and I couldn't just find one of this area here, which was a collection of bone, which I'll go into more detail later. And I have to say the pit itself also contained charnel remains of 3 separate individuals. So there's the individual of this collection of bone. We also have a 1-year-old child, and we also have a child who was 3 to 4 years old. And so their bones have somehow ended up in the backfill of this quarry pit. So, next, what do I go on to next? Oh yeah, the sarcophagus, of course. So, even though, I should point out here, probably rather than in the conclusions of this talk, that to have so much funerary archaeology together in Bath is relatively rare, and it's the different types. You've got people who are just bits of bone in a pit, then you've got 2 cremations and a sarcophagus that contains not 1 but 2 people. So to have this amount going on in an area that's only like 6 by 10 meters wide is exceptional. So move on to the next one. Okay, so the sarcophagus. So this photo here marks the very first photo I received that my team had found something of significance. And apart from exclaiming, "Oh my goodness," you weren't lying, were you? My initial things there were, before I went to Susanna to tell her that we'd found potentially something this significant, was, are we sure it's not a lid? Can you dig down alongside it? And also, can you tell me if this is in situ? I.e., is this just a bit of stone that's discarded and we just happen to have found it, or is it where it was left? And we quickly found out that actually it was in situ. And so here's an early excavation photograph of the sarcophagus within its cut, within its grave cut. So relatively narrow, as you can see, and this side, the northeast side, was actually a bit more sloping down in order to give it some access, easier access. But what I should point out is because they inadvertently placed their sarcophagus into a prehistoric quarry pit, the fill of the quarry pit was soft, and therefore there was subsidence. So the angle across here is something like 25 degrees between this corner here and this corner here. So there was a bit of a slant. And so when we excavated it, we were careful, because we didn't understand at the time the condition of the stone of the sarcophagus. And we'd seen others excavated locally that just kind of fell apart after you took the fill away from the sides. We excavated this in quadrants, and out of the quadrants we were finding beads, and we found 7 beads outside the sarcophagus. So the next step, sorry, I should say that's a bead there, just one of them. The next step was we actually did an endoscope survey of the interior of the coffin, where we put a tiny little camera through a crack here and tried to ascertain the conditions of inside the sarcophagus. And we were able to tell that it's silted up, but most importantly what we were able to tell was it was very moist inside, and we believe that in revealing the sarcophagus to the modern day elements, it was causing potential damage to the inside by increasing the humidity. And so we had to act quickly in order to preserve what was inside. And after several meetings, it was decided that we'd excavate the sarcophagus in situ, because we didn't want to cause any more damage to it, but also because we didn't want it to be damaged by the potential building that would or landscaping that would happen on top of it. So, don't know how hard you have to press the button for it. No? Oh, okay, here we are. So the excavation began. I should state for the record that 2 things had to happen and be in place before we could excavate. The first one is a burial license for the Ministry of Justice, which you have to take out every time you exhume human remains. Although they took their time over this one, and it took them 2 weeks, because I think that they were genuinely interested in it. We excavated another skeleton on Sulis Downs in Bath a couple of weeks ago, and the turnaround was 18 hours. So, I think they pick and choose which ones they pay attention to. Here you can actually see the Roman wall, and I'm not sure if it's that visible, but we did the ground reductions here, and in order to have safe access into the sarcophagus. But there you can just see the line of the fill of the quarry pit here, and then it sort of tails off down here. So here we have Sally Strachey, Historic Conservation team, who've been working in the park for a very long time, devise a way to lift the coffin and the lid. So they lifted the lid in the 2 pieces, and the 2 pieces of lid went and got stored, and then similarly at the end of the excavation they came and took the sarcophagus away, put it into a box and into temporary storage. Should note at this point there is a east-west crack across the top of the lid. We wondered at the time, was this a 2-piece lid? Because you do find sarcophagi lids in 2 pieces, or was this a more modern crack? and it was a more modern crack. It wasn't supposed to be there, and this was supposed to be one full piece of lid. So when we took the lid off, I don't know, do I have to point it at my computer? All right. Okay, so the excavation. So this is, I should say, I'm not using photographs for this technically. I'm using our photogrammetry models, which you can see on Sketchfab. I think you've been provided with a link for that. If not, just check out our Twitter page, and we're releasing them that way. So you can see the silt here, all very cracked. And then there's because of the slope and of the subsidence of the coffin itself, it's a lot thicker at this end. So when we started peeling this away for a 100% sample of everything that was inside, we were able to find very, very thin laminations within the silt. So that meant that actually this had been silting up for centuries. It was a very slow drip, drip, drip process. It wasn't a case of there'd been a flood at some point and left a lot of silt in there. It was a very, very, very slow process. So all of the silt was collected, and I've added this slide in just to try and illustrate exactly how we tried to excavate the interior of the coffin. So you can just about pick out there is a string line going across the centre, and then there are two string lines across here, dividing it into 6 segments. Each segment got a letter, and then we started to excavate down in spits, and there were 5 spits in total. We were actually expecting about 10 or 12 based upon the depth of the sarcophagus from the outside, but once we actually got inside the sarcophagus, we realised that the void was actually relatively shallow. So I think that the chiselers, the stonemasons, only did as much as they could do in terms of creating the void, and they kind of did no more. So the actual depth of the sarcophagus on the outside is about 45 centimetres, and on the interior it's about 25. So we were certainly expecting a deeper excavation. So it didn't take us long to come across bone, but rather than taking you through each single spit, I'll take you right to the end, because that's the cool bit. So here we have a prone skeleton. So that means that they were placed face down, and here at the base, upon the feet of the prone person, is a disarticulated collection of bones, mainly long bones, I have to say. So it didn't take us long to figure out that this was a prone burial, because this being the right shoulder was the first thing that we found, but it's the right shoulder on the left-hand side of the coffin. So we were able to tell that quite quickly. And as you can see here, the preservation of the torso is quite poor. The pelvis is pretty much non-existent, and there's quite a lot of damage to the skull, or it's not really damage, I suppose. It's more sort of degradation over time. But unfortunately, when you try and attribute age or sex to a skeleton, the main bits that you need are the pelvis and the torso and the skull. So it's made some of our assessment work just that little bit more complicated. So hopefully you can see some fingers here, finger bones. And so the person was placed specifically with their hands on their thighs, and for some reason face down. So I have the osteological information here, which I got yesterday, so bear with me. I'm not as smooth as talking about this section as I am about the others. But the prone body itself had about a 65% survival rate, which ain't bad, really, which isn't bad. So, yes, age. The age of this one is, I've been cautioned by our osteoarchaeologists to try and not be drawn on age. So we're able to tell that this is adult, and we're able to tell that she is probably female. So when you're trying to sex a skeleton, you have male, probably male, don't know, probably female, and female. So we've gone with probably female on this one, based upon the fact that we don't have all of the items that we need to be able to age or sex the skeleton. But the teeth, which, to be fair, you can't really see, there weren't many of them. There were 9 teeth, but only 4 of them still had the root in. So this person was pretty much toothless when she died, and but that could either be from age, or it could be from poor diet. And based upon the denticular wear of the teeth, we can probably say that this woman was probably over 35. So there you go. But she also had quite a painful life. So let's see, the pathology. She had a fracture to the proximal shaft of the right femur. So here we go. This is the right femur. So as your femur comes up, you tend to have a little sort of side segue of bone, and then you have the big ball socket that goes into the hip. That had completely broken off, and it was infected. And she lived for a time with an infection in her leg, and also a relatively inoperable hip. Inoperable meaning like it didn't work that well, not like you did some hip surgery back in the Roman period. So, unfortunately, because of the survival condition, you can see just how poorly the pelvis survived. We don't have the other part of the fracture, and thus we're kind of unable to tell just anything about whether she would have walked with a limp, how much this would have curtailed her life. But having watched my mother go through 2 hip replacements, I can only imagine that this was an awful lot of pain. What we also have is a sort of degenerative disease on the right shoulder. So this is the clavicle. So that is probably something along the lines of osteoarthritis or porosis. Which one was it? No. Sorry, there's a lot of big words in what she's tried to tell me. Anyway, a degenerative bone disease. This was also found in the other hip joint over here. Sorry, no, that was the left one. I have to do it in reverse because she's upside down. And then also we have a lumbar fracture that actually healed. So at some point in her life, she probably fell over, hurt her back, and gradually it got better again. So this joint got better again, and this one must have severely impacted her ability to move, I would have thought. So moving on to the person at the bottom, so if I just move back to this one. This person, only 25% of the bones remain at the moment. There's a story behind that. So this is mainly long bones, but we're able to tell from some of them that she is also probably female. And this person here represents the first person who was actually in the sarcophagus. So this person was probably the original occupant, and she was scooped out, for want of a better term, when they lifted the coffin lid, hence the crack, so they've damaged the coffin lid halfway through trying to inter a new body. They've put another person in, maybe a century or two later. They've put her in face down, and then they've picked up what's left of the bones that they can find, and they have placed them at the feet of this person, and then they've shut the lid again. So there are a few ways that we've been able to tell that. So we managed to find a mandible in here, and we obviously originally thought that it was for this person, but it wasn't. It actually matches the mandible, but if you remember I told you there was a collection of bones here. It actually matches the other side of the mandible that was found outside the coffin. We were also to find that inside the ribs there was a tooth. But what on earth is the tooth doing in the ribs? And the tooth actually fits the mandible on the outside of the coffin. So we're able to tell quite confidently that this person exists, or existed until we got to her, inside and outside of the sarcophagus. But what we're also able to tell is, remember I said that there were beads on the outside and there were 7 of them. Well, we took all of the contents of the coffin away and we put it through sieves, lots and lots of different size sieves. And we managed to find 45 new beads. I'll try and get to that slide. Come on. I don't know which way I'm supposed to point it really. Okay, so here are a few of them. So, having spoken to Zosha, the collections manager at the Roman Museum, prior to our excavation, they had 3 or 4 Roman beads, and so they've now got another 45 to add to their collection. So she's very happy. And we found it's very difficult, it's going to be very difficult to prove that this is definitely, the beads on the inside match something that was worn by the individual on the inside of the coffin. It's going to be difficult to tell that they belong to the same thing, because the beads generally, they weren't all matching. They were just really nice little articles placed on like a strip of leather or string or something like that. But because we have bones inside and outside of the sarcophagus, we're able to strongly hypothesize that actually in taking out the first body, they left a lot of the beads on the inside and just a few of them managed to be on the outside. And so we're able to add more to this sort of interesting story of reinterment, which I'm told, I'm told that even though we know that reinterment was very common, and so they would reuse coffins as and when they could in sort of the later antiquity, it's very difficult to find actual snapshot evidence like we have here of the reuse of the coffin because generally the first person was removed and never seen of or heard of again. And so you'd always just have one body in the coffin. But here we actually have a sort of frozen snapshot in time of one person unceremoniously getting dumped inside and outside the coffin, and a new person being put in face down. So that is why this is significant and rare. When you take that in sort of the context of, we also have bits of 3 people from the pit, we also have 2 cremations. This is just one tiny window, and we've got so much going on in a small area of the Bathwick Cemetery, or Roman cemetery. And so what else is out there? What else is under the park? So just to sum up, really, what's next for me and my team? Well, we've got a deadline and a report to deliver. So we're doing a draft report for the middle of August, and then a final report in September. And this will draw together all of our fact finding, and then it will make recommendations for further work, which is something that we're tied into in the planning system through something called a written scheme of investigation, and we've promised to answer certain research questions. So what could be in the next phase? Well, it could, but may not be limited to, the potential for some DNA, ancient DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and that would help us try and establish not only diet and health, but also potential origins of people. Carbon-14 dating, obviously that's quite handy, although we do have a quantity of pottery from the urns, and then also the prehistoric pit that's going to help at least give us a nice sort of terminal dating on either side. And the other part of my job, which I'm not an archaeological scientist, so I'm kind of staying out of all of this more complex stuff, is the research. So it's trying to put what we have found in our excavation into the wider context of what this means for Bath, what this meant for funerary practices in Bath, but also the wider southwest region, because there's something called the Southwest Archaeological Research Framework, and one of their key things is to actually know more about Roman funerary practices in southwest Britain. So this ties in nicely with lending more information to that objective, and also to spend some time with collections in Bath Museum. I have been invited, but I haven't managed to get the time yet to go and have a look at some of the other skeletons of the people that have been found in Bath already, and also other regional collections. So there might be things down in the Somerset Heritage Centre and such like that I can have a look at. And then we're aiming for analysis and publication at some point next year. So there you have it, a very quick, well, maybe it wasn't quick, but a run through of the excavation, what we found, why it's important, and what's next. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I think we have. You're right.
Yeah, I'll just sit down.
Okay, absolutely excellent. Great. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. We decided we're gonna kind of finish probably in about 20 minutes or so. So does anybody have anything that you want to ask? Yes.
Yes, please. That was great. Thank you very much. 2 questions about the coffin. What's it made of? And well, 3 questions. And do we know where the stone came from? And the other one, just thinking about the crack in the lid. If you were the guys that were digging down to open it up to show another body. Is there a possibility that they never took the whole of the lid off, they just took half the lid off, and then that's why they left some bones inside, because they just sort of scooped out what they could reach easily, then put the new body in and put the lid back on?
Yes. So it's made of Bath limestone. We don't yet know exactly the source of the Bath limestone, but there is potential for I've forgotten the name, XRF dating, which would help to compare it with other coffins and also other limestone artefacts to try and understand if they're the same source. So we're not going to do an awful lot of work on the coffin at the assessment stage, but it's something for the analysis stage, because actually it's a beautiful thing in its own right. It must have taken an age to quarry out and then chisel out and then transport, and it's really well finished. And the guys from Stratigraphy, who work with stone all the time, they were really impressed with just the sheer labour and craftsmanship that went into it. And then with regards to the crack in the lid, the northern section of the sarcophagus lid is slightly tilted, and so we think that they probably tried to move it all and they couldn't, and so it cracked. And so they just took off half. Actually, they probably did themselves a favour, and then they put the lid back on after they had swapped the bodies around. So,
and that would explain maybe why the bones were left inside, because they couldn't do a good job of clearing it down.
Yeah, they couldn't reach in the other way.
Brilliant.
Any others? Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned a, I think, 6 by 10 metre area of Roman stratigraphy. Is that the only area? Was the area outside that all Victorian and disturbed, or was it just you couldn't or didn't have the opportunity to look further out?
So the area to the north, sorry, no, it's not north, it's east. The area to the east was disturbed by Victorian landscaping. And once we found the area of stratigraphy, that kind of limited further works, because we didn't want to find more human remains. But also, there's also no way of telling that there are more human remains, because we couldn't look at them. So it's a kind of paradoxical situation. We didn't want to find and exhume more bodies. We wanted them to stay where they were, which is what the National Planning Policy Framework suggests that you should always try and do, is keep archaeology in situ. But at the same time, we can't necessarily be confident that there's more there because we can't see it. I would say that there's a bit more there, but we were in an interesting area that was sort of in between the bowling green and the tennis courts. I should imagine that the tennis courts probably have truncated any archaeological remains there. So we were in a very sort of liminal space, really.
And the bowling green and tennis courts are Victorian or old anyway, so building those would have disturbed them.
Tennis courts are older than the bowling greens. I'm sure there's a park expert in here that can tell you, but from looking at historic maps, the bowling green was a nursery for quite some time before they built the bowling green. So.
Well, I guess my real question is, why don't we just excavate the whole city gardens to see what there is underneath?
Well, how much money do you have?
Yeah.
We didn't really have any budget for any of this. So it's all contingency.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
Yeah, I mean, the reason is that you keep archaeology in the ground for as long as possible until it's threatened. And here it was threatened because it was either going to fill, it was either going to fill a skip effectively, or or have a park, children's play park built on it. And so there was a serious risk to the longevity of that archaeology. And so that's why we took the action that we did. There isn't a risk in other parts of the park, and so that's why we keep it where it is.
Yeah.
There's definitely more stuff out there, but why disturb it if you don't need to?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Can I just ask, did they find anything when they were excavating the canal and the railway, or was that just did they not bother at that time? Because they went deeper. I mean, it would have been quite interesting.
So in a roundabout way, yes. So the canal is gravel lined, and they would have extracted gravel from parts of the park in order to construct it. And so they very probably found sarcophagi getting the gravel for the lining of the canal. So in a roundabout way, yes, but not actually like through the. There's nothing recorded in the historic environment record anyway of anything along that canal.
Brian, what's it unusual for bodies to be put in a stone sarcophagus? And would that indicate any social standing of the person who's put in it?
Yes. Unusual. I wouldn't say it was unusual for people to be put into a coffin. They are a stone coffin and buried, I should say, at this period of time. But what it does do, as you say, is it confers a certain element of status on the person within, because whoever would have buried them, their family, their parents, their husband, wife, they must have had the economic resources to have that amount of labour put into quarrying the stone, carving the stone, and then carrying somehow the stone to the cemetery. And so they would have been of economic resource. So we have had a look. There's about, I think there's 6 sarcophagi already in Bath Museum. And then there's been a few found out and around on the outskirts of Bath, and they're in more other regional museums. But they don't tend to come with complete people in them. And so here we've got one relatively complete person and a bit of another. And so that's another feather in the cap for this excavation, because the first person definitely would have had some economic standing. Not that anyone cared 100 and 150 years later when they scooped them out. But then we can't say what the status of the prone body inside the coffin would have been. Why were they reusing it? Was it just a trend at the time? So we can't say much about that second person's economic status. So yeah.
Was it a north-south position?
Yeah, it was. So it's on a north-south axis, and so that's always interesting to know relatively immediately, because then you're dealing with somebody a bit earlier in the Roman period of Britain. It was quite interesting that somehow in a press release, the north-south axis got turned into a north-facing aspect. So I don't know how you have a north-facing aspect from a coffin, but it got changed around a bit and repeated mistakes in various media outlets. But yeah, it was north-south, so the person in it strongly suggests the first person at least was pagan. Who knows what the second person was.
Why is that pagan north-south?
It's a very simple question. You've got me. I don't know why it's north-south. I know I learned it at university. But when it's east-west, it's because of the access to Jerusalem.
chance that if you do a DNA analysis that they could be related?
There's always a chance that any skeleton can be related to another skeleton. There is a chance of that. It is a question that has come up among the team, and also whether the small votive offering, as we initially called it, buried at the top of the grave cut, whether that, now that we know it's human, is that related? So there's a potential, but only if the condition of the bones lend themselves to DNA. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting question to answer, but I'm not sure that we have the condition of the material to answer that question. But also saying about the time difference, the first person must have turned to bone in order for the method of removal. So that's taking 100, 150 years. But limestone. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but sarcophagus actually means flesh-eating box in Greek. And they specifically chose limestone because it has a caustic properties. And so when you put a body inside limestone, or as this is the case, it's likely to degrade a whole lot faster. So we could be looking at something about 50 to 80 years instead. So.
Yes. Sorry, my first, I just got a couple of questions with that. The first one's really ignorant, which is, I appreciate you don't want to really put dates on it yet, but you obviously said it's Roman, so what does that sort of make the latest date that it could be? And then, as soon as I've got special interest in the other Roman sarcophagus in Bathwick over at the churchyard, and I just wondered if during your work you looked at, because that was found close to here, I just wondered if you knew where it was found, because I've tried to find out and I've never managed to find it.
Right, so first question. We've researched other coffins in the area for a date. Typologically, they're all quite similar, and that looks to be 3rd century AD, and that would kind of tie in with like Bathwick as kind of metropolitan height as it was. But the dating, we're still waiting for our pottery report back, which will be able to give us like dates on either side of some of the things that we found in the excavation. But really it's going to be carbon-14 dating that will give us an accurate picture. So at the moment we can say like 3rd century, but for the second person and the reinterment, maybe we're looking at 4th or 5th century and it being a bit later. So at the moment it's like a bit of pin the tail on donkey. And then no, I haven't had a look at the other sarcophagus or the other coffin. Sorry, where did you say it was?
It's in Bathwick churchyard at the moment, but I've never been able to find out where around here it was found.
No,
I think you mentioned at the beginning that some people where they were.
Yeah, so what's actually Susanna has been doing it. There's a lot of unprovenanced coffins within this area, and there was a recent book written on Bath and Archaeological Assessment. And they said that there was like 23 coffins from the cemetery, but actually I think they've counted several of them several times, which is quite easy to do with HER information if you don't actually rigorously research the actual primary sources and you just rely on the secondary, so-and-so said it was here. And there's a lot of things of like, this was like 250 paces east or west of this, which is nice, but it's kind of a bit treasure mappy and a bit not as accurate. So I think this is the first one that we have an actual accurate location. So that's something.
Is there another question at the back? Anyone else? Did you have one?
No, my question's been answered.
Okay, great. Yeah, Margaret.
Why face down?
Yeah, we don't know. So there's a kind of how do I put this politely? There's a kind of fascination with bodies that are placed face down because some people think maybe they were naughty in real life. Maybe they weren't well liked. Maybe they just got the shroud the wrong way round. But there is a sort of fascination with prone burials, just because it's not the norm, but it's also just it's not rare either. So it's very difficult to say why. We can never really know. Maybe if they could only lift one side of the coffin, that was the easiest way to bend her in. So you know, who I don't really quite know. So, but it's something that when we put it on social media, there's actually quite a lot of interest of why prone, but we can never really say. So
You instantly think being naughty.
yeah. Naughty, done something wrong. Couldn't look up to the heavens. Things of that nature. And I think when the prone bodies have been found in antiquarian context, where the antiquarians generally live in quite a more highly Christianized society than we do now, the initial thing is like, they must have done something, to upset God or something like that, or they were prevented from ascending to heaven by looking down. So, but whether that still can resonate now in our society, I'm not sure. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of talk about that at some point. I'll never have an answer.
I was going to ask you, Kelly, because one of the things that I was lucky enough to come to the park one day when you were right in the middle of it all.
Yeah, we were lifting the body.
Yeah, and I did find it incredibly moving, actually. And I wondered also, like as an archaeologist or as somebody who's going through those finds, kind of a different way of not just about facts, but like your feelings about it, or what that process is like for you in terms of, the emotional impacts. I'm really interested to hear about that.
Well, I've never had that question before. I would say that whenever we find a skeleton or a cremation, we want to be able to do the best job possible and treat the remains with as much respect as possible. But some people think that taking away parts of a skeleton in a bucket or a bag or and washing them and sieving them isn't respectful, and I can see that argument, to be honest. But it's more respectful in my mind to do that and reinter them, because I should say that the law states that we have to rebury these people within the next 5 years. It's more, in my mind, it's more respectful to do that than it is to have them end up in a skip, squished by a building, and or just maybe half sectioned or something along those lines. So it's always, you just want to do the most respectful job, really. And I didn't really find this one that emotional. In terms of, this poor person died, I actually found it very exciting. So if we're talking about emotions, because I've spent 20 years in archaeology, and I've never been able to have a project that told someone's story in a way that this does. Often I find truncated buildings, I find prehistoric enclosures, and I have excavated on cemeteries before, but those cemeteries have been workhouse cemeteries, and they tell, yes, a very sad and sometimes quite horrific story of a person's life. But you never, because this is small, compact, and it's almost kind of gift wrapped archaeology. We can tell a story like no one else has before of a person in Bath. I mean, you've got the Walcott man that was found in the 90s, and the museum did a really good job interpreting his life and origins and things that now we can do better. So we've got something new and important to tell, and there's more information for the audiences that come to Bath, which are many, to understand about the people that live here. So really, excitement is my overriding emotion.
That's great, thank you so much. Any last questions? Yes, it might be one you can't answer. I was wondering if you had information on gender likelihood of being a sarcophagus burial. Is it something that there is a gender bias, that it's usually men that you find in them versus women? So you've got 2 women in there.
I don't know that answer, to be honest, and it's going to be difficult to do that in a place like Bath, where at an early date the bodies were separated from the sarcophagi quite early, and so speaking with Zosha at the museum, she's tried to do her best job of looking at photos and thinking, well, this bone looks like that bone in that photograph, and the burial of the body actually becomes quite divorced from its sarcophagus context. So even though we've taken the body away and it's no longer near a sarcophagus, it won't always be that way, and the information will be stored and archived in a modern day way. But in terms of if there's a preference for male or female over in sarcophagi, no, but I would say she probably had a rich husband.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you, Kelly. Really, really, thank you so much. Brilliant. So just to finish with, I think you heard Kelly mention that thing about photogrammetry. Have I got that right? Grammetry. Is that on R? So there's been some recent 3D modelling, and we will, all of you booked in through Eventbrite, did you?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. So we'll send you an email out through Eventbrite giving you a link to that online